This is the first time I've posted up a video relating to Warhammer, and it might be that this gets a bit rambly and obscure in places, since it's not only about a specific race of creatures, but it's also very much about a specific army that inspired me. That is Andy Chambers' Skaven army of 1991. The motivation to make this video came from a number of sources. Firstly, from turning 50 this year, which was a bit of a milestone that brings with it a kind of greater time to reflect and think back on life lived thus far. Having collected this army since 1985, there was also both a decision and a realisation that it is now finally finished. Although, in the words of Tolkien, finished but not finished with, hopefully, and so I wanted to document that completion. Also, as I've got older, there's an awareness that time is limited and that I won't be around forever. So I wanted to have a resource online that my wife or my daughters could point folks to when they are maybe sorting through my stuff and thinking about selling off my Warhammer collection once I'm gone. And then perhaps this army will end up in new hands. Thirdly, with the release of the Old World at the start of 2024, it seems that more folks are now interested in rank and file armies from past games of fantasy. And I really enjoyed Dr. Luke Blacksill's video on his 1980s Chaos Army, the sentiments of which I can relate to strongly. So here we are, 15,000 points of Skaven, mostly lead, mostly the original Jes Goodwin sculpts from the 80s. This army is the antithesis of speed painting. Not a single one of the 700 or so models was batch painted. I spent time detailing even the lowliest of slaves, which is probably why it's taken me over 39 years to complete. Growing up in the 1980s, my route into Warhammer was via my gran telling me the story of the Lord of the Rings on a car journey back from Bude when I was aged 10, the days before cars had stereos in them. Something about hearing that story, even in its heavily edited form, propelled me to seek out the books, which then had such a potent impact on my development as a teenager, and at the same time led me to start to discover the fighting fantasy books written by the creators of Games Workshop, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, which further sort of cemented this love of fantasy. At the same time, I began to notice these incredibly detailed lead models in the model shops that my dad would take me into to buy bits for his railway. My first figure was this one, a Jes Goodwin Asgard miniatures orc. This is not my paint job, by the way. It wasn't long after this that I discovered that there was a shop in Birmingham called Games Workshop. At the time, 1985, a Games Workshop store was a very different place to what it was today. The staff didn't wear uniforms. They didn't pounce on you the moment you arrived and ask you if they could help. They wore Metallica t-shirts and leather jackets and made you feel that you'd interrupted them if you wanted to buy something. This had the effect of making the whole thing feel more aloof and therefore more exciting and desirable as a young boy, because you wanted to be a part of what these cool older dudes were doing, and you had to put a bit of effort into chasing what was going on, since things weren't given to you on a plate then. There were no starter sets, no easy entry routes into gaming to allow you to pick up and play. There were these 3-book rule sets that came in a box with beautiful John Blanche illustrations on the front and enormous books of Realm of Chaos rules that were suggested for mature readers only. A little later, I also discovered Warhammer Fantasy roleplay with the same group of friends at school, and we played through the Enemy Within campaign. All of this fantasy was like a magnet to me, and so my pocket money was saved up for trips into town on a Saturday to buy models. The first appearance of the Skaven was in the Citadel Compendium of 1985, when they were called the Chaos Rat Men, and at the time Games Workshop also released many other Chaos races. There were ostrich-headed beastmen, Chaos Snake Men, 2-headed Chaos Goblins, and many other obscure one-off creatures such as death elementals and arcane monstrosities. So I bought my first blister pack of Skaven, and I remember it contained Flench Packlord, Plague Monk, and Scree the Slaver. And I think I fell in love with these sculpts then, these incredible acquisitive beady faces that oozed character, and these worm-like tails, all hand-sculpted by Jes Goodwin, in the days before it was all designed on computers. So I painted these up, aged 11, and made up the colours as you do when you're younger. But then the following spring in 1986, the third Citadel Journal was released, and as well as this incredible cover by John Blanche, which totally captivated my imagination, it has this extensive article on the Skaven, written by Jes and Rick Priestley. This really cemented them as a race, and gave background on the 4 major clans and their weapons of warfare that drew on World War I archetypes such as poison gas and fire throwers, and it had these wonderful pencil drawings by Jes and Tony Ackland. There was also a scenario, Vengeance of the Lichmaster, that followed on from a previous Warhammer campaign pack. This was a 3-way battle between Skaven, Undead and Bretonnian monks at La Maison-Tale Abbey to recapture the Black Ark of the Covenant, and it included the possibility of a Dalek, alongside cardboard cutout buildings on the cover by Dave Andrews. All of these artists had a huge impact on me, and directed me to the painters Albrecht Dürer and Altdorfer later in my life, and then finally to university to study art myself. Currently, I work as an artist making paintings. There was also a great painting guide by John Blanche. These were the days when you were encouraged to take time painting models, before contrast paints and airbrushes came along. And so I would paint that way, taking hours over a single figure, partly because the models were so expensive and you couldn't afford to buy many. Although looking back, £1.95 for 3 sounds crazy compared to today's prices. There was also a cartoon featuring the Skaven and a Chaos Warrior who'd been sort of redeemed called Caleb Dark. So I eagerly saved up and brought a few more models, began painting them and learning how to dry brush fur, which was something that Jes modelled very well. The newer plastic Skaven never seemed to have quite got fur right. The current models look a little bald to me. And then Warhammer 3rd edition arrived, and we were playing in the way that 12 and 13-year-old kids play. The rules were pretty loose and fast, but huge amounts of fun. Certainly the way we interpreted them. Friendships begun then over Warhammer have lasted me my entire life, and my main opponent now as a 50-year-old was my opponent then as a 12-year-old. There was a Skaven army list in both Ravening Hordes and Warhammer armies, but I wasn't really attracted to Pete Taylor's paint scheme, as it was a little too bright for me. What completely bowled me over, however, was when I discovered this issue of White Dwarf, and with it, Andy Chambers' Skaven army. This is White Dwarf 137. Now, I'm far from being the only player to be captivated by this army. This has become for many people the archetype of what a Skaven army should look like. It was painted in 1991, during the time of Warhammer 3rd edition, right at the start of the heavy metal era of cartoonish bright colours that made your army pop like a bottle of R. White's lemonade. And what was incredible about it was a confidence with which it rejected that need to draw your attention in through this garish assault on your retina. But it simply sat there in this utterly realistic way. It was dirty, unkempt, covered in war paint and runes and bits of mud and rocks stuck to the bases. It was fantastic. It made me want to know as much as I could about these Skaven in every way. Much more recently, Andy has posted up some detailed shots of the army on Facebook, where you can see the individual models in greater detail, and I've taken these images as a guide in photographing my own army. Like most people, I fell out of the hobby for a few years, but then revisited it as an adult, round about the time of 5th and 6th edition, during which time Skaven had gone through some development. Unlike many other Games Workshop races, the lore and look of the Skaven has remained consistent since their inception, which is great when you are a collector, since it means that you can use old models alongside newer ones. And as 6th edition landed, there were a number of source books that arrived and fleshed out the race. We were introduced to the idea of rat cults in the Empire, Clanation armies in Storm of Chaos, Clan Pest Islands armies in Lustria, and also Clan Moulder armies, in a wonderfully comprehensive White Dwarf article by Phil Kelly. With the release of 6th edition, there was a scenario on the Games Workshop website about a battle between Clan Scryer and Clan Pest Islands for a warpstone mine, and that introduced the Rat Tank, Captured Empire steam tank, an idea that also featured in the Gotrek and Felix novels. All of these were elements that I wanted to include in my own Skaven army, and as 8th edition came out, Games Workshop finally included Skaven in the introductory box, alongside High Elves, and another book of lore was released, The Uniforms and Heraldry of the Skaven. Before I talk you through the individual units in my army, it would be remiss of me not to mention the website of Tristram Evans, who has catalogued in more detail than anyone else on the planet, as far as I can tell, the development and models of the Skaven. Do check out his website. If you Google Pareidolia Skaven, you should find it. Andy Chambers wrote the 4th edition army book for Skaven, and in it he talks you through the rationale behind the units. He says that every Skaven army needs a large block of clan rats for the warlord to hide in, lots of ranks to mitigate their low leadership. This is Flench Packlord's Black Claws, 62 lead clan rats with hand weapons, which includes every original Jes Goodwin sculpt of the clan rats. You can see here that there's a close-up of the individual models, including the original plastic Skaven from Warhammer armies. And here we've got the battle banner of the army. This is very heavily modelled on Andy's design, alongside Tretch Craventail, who's one of the newer 7th edition chieftains. And here we have the 6th edition Screaming Bell. By the 7th edition of Warhammer, the bell included a rat ogre who was ringing it. So I added one onto the front of this model. In my model, he's kind of pulling it along. I really like the lead model, and I like the fact that the Grey Seer was kind of up high, surveying all of his troops. This is Grey Seer Skrek Warp Squealer. Andy's army includes a spear-armed unit of clan rats to protect the flank of that big unit, so I included 2 of these, one for each flank, 36 clan rats with spears. You can see in this unit that it also includes a small unit filler, which is the original Screaming Bell, and this was out of a desire to sort of include every Jes sculpt that there was, without wanting to put another Screaming Bell into the unit. This is Gore Headwrecker's Claw Pack and Malice Manrak's Spear Horde. We've then got 2 units of 20 plastic clan rats. These are the Island of Blood design. I tended to use these as the clan rats for the dreaded 13th spell, when a Grey Seer turns enemy troops into clan rats. I thought they worked quite well as spell rats. There's a couple of fire throwers here to accompany the units. You can see that I've also used cotton wool as flames, which is another thing that Andy Chambers does. There's a couple of units that he mentions in the original article that didn't have models at the time, so he made conversions for them. And it's been hard to track down pictures of these, but there is one picture of a Rattling gun conversion that he made, which seems to have ended up with Alessio Cavatore. There's a picture of it in a White Dwarf article about 500 points games of Warhammer. And this is where I've attempted to recreate it using a Caradron Overlord's gun. And in the background is the original Rattling gun. This is the Doomflayer from Warhammer 7th edition. And he chooses to use plastic Hero Quest models for his Storm Vermin. Jes never designed any specific Storm Vermin as far as I'm aware. The first official ones to appear were made by Marauder Miniatures. For this unit, this was a case of using what I considered to be the best sculpts, which were the 7th edition models by Seb Purbett. There were some chunky 6th edition metal ones, but Seb's models were a little more scruffy and looked less elite somehow, a bit more raggedy. You can see in the middle of the unit there's a palanquin there, carried by guard in the colours of the Council of 13, from the Uniforms and Heraldry of the Skaven book. This is Slake's Thrall Pack, Scuttled Scum and Servile's Levy, which are 3 units of 40 strong slaves. Each unit's got a small unit filler. I'm not a huge fan of unit fillers, but I do like to break up the unit a little bit when there's a lot of models in it. These units have been a staple of every Skaven army that I've fielded. In the 6th edition army book, Alessio Cavatore introduced life is cheap as a rule, which allowed you to fire into combat with your own troops, and Jeremy Vitok continued this for slaves only in the 7th and 8th edition army book. The slaves run as a kind of bus, which is 5 wide and 8 ranks deep. There's some Skaven personalities here. This is the Games Day Chieftain from 2011, one of the Lustria Chieftains, along with Tretch Craventail, and another conversion for Clan Moulder with a 3-armed chieftain. And here we have Lord Skrolk, Queek Headtaker, Icket Claw, and of course Deathmaster Snitch, which leads us nicely into talking about the presence of the 4 clans in the army, beginning with Clanation. In the Loathsome Ratmen and All Their Vile Kin, which was a Black Library book, there are some beautiful illustrations by John Blanche that introduce the idea of Skaven cults into the old world, and a character called Trespass the Rat Boy. He was the inspiration for this unit. In this unit, Nordum has corrupted a gang of peasants, and a small rat cult has been created from Necromunda Ratskin gangers. I use these as gutter runners in games. Clanation featured as an army list in the Storm of Chaos supplement, detailing the original invasion of Archaon in 6th edition, where he was beaten by Grimgor Ironhide. The Clanation list included in this supplement allowed you to field assassin triads. And here we've got 2 assassins working for Special Agent Gracia Scully. The army has 2 20-man Night Runner units, which again are all Jes Goodwin models. Both of them are led by the original Deathmaster Snitch. The first of these is a conversion. I've given him these claws. And in this other unit, you can see that there's also a Mordheim Skaven casualty in there as well. The Warp Grinder weapon team came in 7th edition, which allowed you to tunnel behind enemy lines and emerge your units there. These are Ashish the Black's Sewer Raiders and Scourge Hooknet's colours. These are 2 units of 10 gutter runners. Both of these units don't use Jes Goodwin models because I wanted to differentiate them from the Night Runners. Instead, they use bits of models from Blood Bowl, from Mordheim, and they include Veskit the Executioner. He's one of my favourite characters from Mordheim. There's also the Marauder miniatures of the Gutter Runners. Each clan has its own battle banner. These are the battle banners of Clanation and Clan Moulder. You can see how I've used the art of Hieronymus Bosch and his contemporaries on the Clan Moulder banner, held by this 3-armed chieftain. Clan Moulder was fleshed out in White Dwarf 311 in an article by Phil Kelly delving into the lore behind Hellpit. You can see here Gorich, the Castellan of Clan Moulder. And this was a conversion made at a time when you could literally buy any bit you wanted from Games Workshop via their mail order. That made building these conversions so much easier. Then got a picture of the Throttlings, made by A.D. Wood. These are aborted experiments left to wander the corridors of Hellpit. So back to my army, and we've got 8 rat swarms. Then we've got a large unit of 60 giant rats, which are almost all metal, but they include the Norbeast from Age of Sigmar Skaven Tide box set, with the legs cut down to give it sort of more naturalistic proportions. I wanted a really big rat in the unit. Games Workshop seems to have had a problem with giant rats not being very big. Their plastic giant rats were only slightly larger than normal rats. But Jes Goodwin's original designs were superb, full of character, huge, easily fill a base, and this unit also contains some of the ones that he made for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Every 8th edition Skaven player out there will appreciate the importance of the rat dart, which is a small unit of 5 rats to draw out fanatics, march block, zoom around, and just is perfect chaff. And this is the Master Moulder from the Island of Blood. We've now got some Pack Masters, mostly metal ones. And some more Master Moulders. These are Glart Smash Rip, which is a Forge World model from Blood Bowl. Then there's a new Age of Sigmar Master Moulder, a Blood Bowl conversion, and finally a conversion of a Storm Vermin that I made with a member of the De Cunning crew. And he has 4 arms and 2 heads. Then we've got Rasta Tailspike. There's another Blood Bowl conversion. And a Packmaster that I based on the Legend of the Pied Piper. This is actually the first ever limited edition model. I think it's called Motley Maniac, the Death Jester. Came out in 1985. And I really like the idea of the sort of Pied Piper leading the rats. We've then got some more Packmasters together with Squeal Nortuth. And we've got Throttlian Clean himself together with his Throttlings, which were a lot of fun to make. There's also a Flayakin in there from the Storm of Chaos book. And then we've got 10 Forge World Wolf Rats. Andy has a unit of 9 Rat Ogres in his army, led by a mounted Packmaster that he'd converted from a Blood Bowl Blitzer and a Mutant Ogre that he sculpted fur onto. So in my army I included 2 units of 9 Rat Ogres. Jes Goodwin only sculpted 2 Rat Ogres originally, which were quite small and curiously had no tails. So by today's standards they kind of struggle to fit with the other models. So I used a wide variety of different Rat Ogres alongside those in these units. There are Blood Bowl models, Mordheim models. There's a Clan Scryer Robot Rat Ogre, the original Bone Ripper. And I tracked down the same mutant Rat Ogre that Andy had used, but added a version of Throttlian Clean to it instead of the Blitzer, to act as the unit's leader, a Master Moulder. The second unit has a leader mounted as well, along with some of the Forge World Resin Ogres. There's a Blood Bowl character, Creek Rust Gouger here, as well as Gorich the Castellan that I made from the article. You can see here the leader of that unit. This is my Hellpit Abomination. I love that model. And these are the rats it releases when it dies. And there's the Brood Horror from Forge World. This is the new Brood Terror, which I run as either a unit filler for the Rat Ogres or as an abomination. And then this is the Chimera Rat. This is the 3D printed model because there wasn't an official Games Workshop model. I'm not a huge fan of 3D prints, but in this case, because there was no other model, I think it works okay. It's one of the only 2 3D prints in the army. This is a Brood Horror with Warlord Grizzly Mancarver on it. This is Warlord Squick Tack on a Bonebreaker. This is actually the oldest model in the army. It was made before Slaughter Bases, when models were still lead rather than white metal. It's a conversion of a C-28 Death Demon, ridden by Icket Claw with the Green Knight legs. This is Warlord Sleek Fur on a Pox Rat, which is the other 3D print, again because at the time Games Workshop didn't release one. He has a Storm Vermin Rider torso. It's the summer of 2005. My wife gave birth to my first daughter, and the 6th edition supplement called Lustria was released, and with it the bubonic court of Nurglich army list. And we got Skaven Clampest Islands as their own army. My mate Iggy and I fought out this campaign much later on in 2017, but I'll talk about that more later. For now, the first of the 2 big Clanpest Islands units in my army. This is Spine Blightmaster's Devoted. I've included a Cauldron of 1,000 Poxes in this unit. It worked like a Screaming Bell in 6th edition, but I now use it as a unit filler. This is Weird Banebreath's Brotherhood. This is 39 monks with a Plague Furnace. I'm particularly proud of this converted standard bearer, based on a conversion by Charles Elliott, I think, featured in the original Citadel Journal article. This is Blight Scab's Plague Pack. These are 20 Rotten Rodents, which was a unit taken from Uniforms and Heraldry of the Skaven, and they belong to Clan Septic. The Rotten Rodents are described as sort of plague monks in training. They're actually clan rats. You can see in this unit the first ever Blood Bowl Skaven sculpt right at the front corner of the unit, giving him a sword there. The list also allowed you to field puss bags, which were Skaven slaves that dropped dead each round from disease. There was an article by Owen Rees on how to make puss bags using the plastic plague monks, and you can see 4 of these together with the metal models in the army. There's a unit of 30 here, with the old rat ogre and some cursed city rats as unit fillers. This is Vilebroth Null, who's the battle banner of the army, together with a flamethrower. And Vomix Scab's Plague Censer Bearers. Got 2 units of those. These again are non-Jes Goodwin models. I think Jes only made 1 Plague Censer Bearer, and these Marauder ones are a little more dynamic, so I quite like them. This is a Rat Spawn, which was a rat ogre that got mutated because of its time in Lustria. This is Plague Priest Blistrox, who was a conversion for the End Times campaign from one of the Glotkin Riders. And this is another priest converted from another of the Glotkin Riders. And then we've got Nurglich himself. And a Plague Claw catapult. Clan Scryer never really got an army list. There was a brief one that featured in the 6th edition army book, and there was a battle on a Games Workshop website for control of a warpstone mine between Clan Scryer and Clanpest Islands. And this scenario featured Clawman Cast's Rat Tank. There was also a rat tank in the novel Skaven Slayer, featuring Gotrek and Felix, where Clan Scryer Skaven captured an Empire steam tank in Null. And this model also featured in the back of the Skaven Collector's Guide, so I built one following that in my own army. Again, this was a time when you could order specific bits from the Games Workshop website, so it's got bits from an orc truck on there, as well as the metal steam tank. These are some Skaven Doom rockets. Since I used the original metal Doom wheel in the rat tank, this is the newer plastic one, which I quite like the sculpt of. It's a little less cartoony, it looks a little more dangerous. This is the Warp Lightning Cannon. And then we've got Spiketail's Warp Snipers. These are the newer metal Jezzails, with my favourite ever Skaven sculpt, a commander with Arquebus, who was called Screth the Ironclad, and he leads both of the units. This is the unit with the original Jes Goodwin models. These are the Scarlungs, 3 units of Poison Wing Globadiers. This second unit has got a couple of converted Blood Bowl throwers in it. And a third unit is the Marauder ones. Again, quite liked the sort of chunkiness of these models. And then we've got 2 Poison Wind Mortars. There's a converted one here from the Age of Sigmar Acolytes, together with the one from the Island of Blood set. And then we've got the Stratifier pack, which was 6 Stormfiends. These are the ones with the missile weapons. As we're now entering the end times, this unit is the Electric Coven, which was a very specific unit for end times Thanquol. Consisted of 13 Warlock Engineers. You can see here that there's conversions from Blood Bowl models. There are both metal versions of Ikit Claw, and there's Ratchet from the Island of Blood. It's a lot of fun making that unit. We've now got Heskett One Eye. He's the battle banner bearer of Clan Scryer, and the idea for this was that he sort of has this asbestos glove and carries this metal pole that channels warp lightning. This is the new Age of Sigmar Warlock Master, together with the Chieftain, which is a conversion from the Island of Blood. And then we've got the new version of Thanquol and the old version of Thanquol. And then we've got Lurklox. This is the Forge World Vermin Lord, which is an absolutely great sculpt. I think it's a tremendous model. I found the End Times Vermin Lords that they looked a little too much like sort of He-Man figures. They had very strange ankles and these tiny hooves and awkward poses, but I think this model looks properly terrifying. And then we've got a limited edition Skaven Standard Bearer. This is Rotrick Maulclaw. And then a picture of the first ever Skaven that I painted when I was aged 11 against another one that I painted in 2022. These are both clan rats in my main unit. I'm now going to show you some photos of the army in action, battling its way through various campaigns, beginning with the Christmas battles that took place every year with the same group of mates. You can see here that the edges of the bases are still goblin green before I switched over to painting them black. This is another Christmas battle. And then in 2015, I began to play with a little more intentionality, not just at Christmas. My friend and I began looking at Bloodbath at Orc's Drift, which was one of the first scenario packs ever. It came out in Warhammer 2nd edition. This was a time when Warhammer was a lot sort of lighter and had a lot of jokes in it, and it didn't take itself too seriously. I think in one of the scenarios there's a kind of schizophrenic druid who switches sides depending on what you roll. And all of these battles were quite tongue-in-cheek. So we played through this using a Skaven army instead of an Orc army. And we used his beautifully painted dwarf army. You can see there he used Milliput on the basis and gone for this much sort of more 1980s colour scheme, which just works wonderfully. We moved on to the End Times in 2015 when we'd finished that campaign. This began as a desire to sort of forge our own narrative, to decide whether the old world had actually been destroyed or not in the great cataclysm of the End Times. My route into Games Workshop had been through fighting fantasy books and also through Warhammer roleplay, where you as the player got to choose what happened, and you had a degree of agency and control over the narrative. And along with many others, I felt a little bit steamrolled by the imposition of this destructive narrative that ended the old world that I'd grown up with, which was an incredibly rich, fleshed-out place. So we got together and we decided to see if the world could in fact be saved. We played through End Times Thanquol. This is the first battle, the Mists of Slanhuapek. And in this, the Skaven are attacking Slanhuapek, which is this lizardman city shrouded in mist. You can see at the start of the battle here, we've got the Carnosaur atop of the temple. And in the next few rounds, he charges into the side of one of the clan rat units and routs them completely. Then he switches his charge and ends up charging into the plague furnace along with the Stegodon. This battle didn't end well for the Skaven, they were slaughtered. You can see here Plague Priest Blistrox is about to fall to a Saurus hero. And then we've got Battle 2, which is the Breaking of the Mountains. This was a series of smaller skirmishes fought in Carrick 8 Peaks. These are my friends, dwarfs, These are Iron Drakes, which were a really dangerous unit. And then this is a unit of Slayers chasing off some Rat Ogres. The Wolf Rats and the Doomwheel are assaulting entrenched dwarf position here with a flame cannon. And this is the final battle of the three linked ones, where the dwarf gun line is about to be swamped. The Doomwheel went into the side of the Hammerers here. But then the Clan Rats ran away from the Thunderers, and the line started to collapse. Queek Headtaker managed to pull it back in the end in a duel with Belagar Ironhammer. In the end, Belagar was killed in this rather ignominious way by falling debris from the ceiling. This is one of the extra rules. And the Skaven are at the Dwarf Gate. Chapter 3 was Disaster at Carrot Cadrin, which was an attack on the Slayer Keep involving 3 Hellpit abominations. You can see here there's these fantastic purple mushrooms that Iggy had made for this table. The difficulty with this battle was that we played it long ways down the table, and Iggy had made these incredible ramparts for the Dwarf Slayer Keep, atop of which the Dwarf War Machines could fire out at the Skaven. But the Skaven units were too large, and I didn't really anticipate the lack of manoeuvrability to them. So in this picture we've got a unit of giant rats about to charge into a very small unit of dwarves who just kill a few every turn, and none of the other units can get round. And that's pretty much how the game went. The Hellpit abominations come on at the side of the table later on, and they rush towards the gate. You can see here that one of them is a conversion from the Glotkin model, but unfortunately they were cut down by the Slayers before they got there. Then Chapter 4, this is Death from Beneath, and this is a battle in the city of Null. In this battle, the Skaven Rat Tank is actually being used as an Empire steam tank because we didn't have one, so it's on the side of the dwarfs. The Storm Vermin emerged in the dwarf gun line, and it was looking good for a while. The slaves charged into the tank, along with some rat ogres. The Doomwheel charged into some of the dwarf warriors. You can see in the back there that he's got a battle wizard, which I think was level 4 with the beast's law, because in the next picture he's transformed using the transformation of Kadon into a fire dragon, which was a surprise. And he's facing off there against Thanquol and Bone Ripper. Then the Vermin Lord arrived, and although this picture doesn't look good for the wizard, I think somehow the sort of Empire Dwarf Alliance managed to pull off a win in this battle, and the Skaven were again driven out of Null. Chapter 5 is Ambush on the Trail of Bones, and we're back in Lustria. And there's a Skaven column marching through the jungle, ambushed by the lizard men. You can see here there's the mushrooms again, a wonderful piece of scenery, and the lizard men emerging from the trees. Saurus charged into the rotten rodents. Carnosaur went into some of the slaves, I think, and massacred them. And the skinks went into the plague furnace. All looked lost, but part of the scenario rules is that a Vermin Lord would arrive later on, and he sort of helped quite a lot with the Skaven side at killing the Stegodon, and I think winning the battle. The final battle is the Battle of Karaza Karat, and this was fought in 2016 at Warhammer World on the occasion of my birthday. It was a lot of fun. We decided to fight it on the Tomb King's table because it seemed the most similar to a sort of dwarf city, and it was fought just using infantry according to the scenario rules. So there are 3,250 points of dwarves against the same number of Skaven. Battle lines faced off against each other here. And then the dwarves managed to get a very lucky long bomb charge into the side of one of the Skaven units, killing Ikit Claw. And you can see Thorgrim Grudgebearer there is really going for it with his hammerers, and I think that routed the other unit as well. so it wasn't good for the Skaven. But then Queek Headtaker managed to roll incredibly lucky for some of its attacks, and he killed Thorgrim in combat. However, his unit was then routed by some Iron Drakes. At the end of the battle, some Slayers arrived, and I think one of the rules for this battle was that you could recycle units. So my slaves came back on, and it looked a little bit like Skaven had won for a while, but then we totted up the points and realised that it was again quite a comprehensive dwarf victory. So End Times Thanquol ended with the victory for the Forces of Order. So 2017, we moved on to the Lustria campaign, and we fought that between 2017 and 2019. It finished just before COVID arrived a few months later. We used this campaign map with pins, the green ones representing the Skaven forces, the orange ones the Lizardmen. This is the first battle, and I think it was for the Watchtower. You can see some of the great scenery that Iggy had made for this. He actually works as a landscape architect, so he does this sort of stuff all the time, but it was really top-notch scenery. The Hell Pit there is headed into some Saurus, and the battle lines really met at the tower. The Rat Ogres ran off again, which seems to happen quite a lot in games. In the end, I think the Grey Seer managed to transform some of the lizards in the tower into clan rats and move some of his own troops in as well. So I think that one was a victory to the Skaven, but it was close. There's another battle here, a slightly different layout, but using the same army. A Plague Priest climbing over the temple. A view from the Lizardmen lines with Teto Echo in control. The Carnosaur charging into the side of the Brood Horror again was disastrous, just caused enormous amounts of damage, and the Hell Pit couldn't get around to help. This is, I think, the third or fourth battle, and it involves an assault on a temple. I think it's called the Rise of Clanpest Islands. Again, Carnosaur went into the side of some puss bags and just swallowed them. Some Plague Censer Bearers did quite well against the Stegadon though. I think to win this scenario you had to get a Skaven unit on top of the temple. And in the end it looks like we managed it with Lord Skrolk and some of the Plague Censer Bearers. This was the final battle of the campaign, which was centred around a spawning pool, and it involved, I think, a third of the Skaven army having to get to a certain point on the table. The Saurus, I think, fled from a unit of Plague Monks, but then the Raptorix or Raptodons or something swooped in, caught them from behind. This is one of the Lizardmen personalities. He's fighting off Lord Skrolk. And in the end, that campaign ended badly for the Skaven as well, because we didn't quite get enough troops into the corner, and the Lizardmen by that time had got all of their pins on the board, and it was a Lizardman victory, so they'd successfully driven the Skaven out of Lustria. And that brings us on to 2020, where we started playing the Dark Shadows campaign, which was a campaign set in the Isle of Albion. The first two battles of that were Skaven landing on Albion, and there were 3 little boats. It was a 500 points battle. The Skaven were in the boats, and they had to make it onto the hill with the dwarf war machines on. 2 of the boats ran aground, and lots of models drowned. And I think in this one there's 4 night runners that make it up onto the hill, but they don't last long because the dwarf war machine crew are pretty tough in combat. So if you're still with me, thank you for getting this far. I hope the video has been of some interest to at least one person, and thank you very much for watching it. Goodbye.